What's up, everybody? Thank you all for coming. And today we're back with another episode of Duel Academy. And this time we want to be taking an in depth look on how to read cards. Now, with me, I'm joined by Axel, avid TCG player, goes to nationals, claps cheeks, is amazing. How's it going, Axel?
I'm good, man. How are you today?
I'm great. So, walk us through how do I read these cards? They have all these words on them. I don't understand, and I'm losing duels. How do I read them?
Yeah, for sure. The first example I wanted to look at
Hmm.
was the two main types of effects that you'll see when you are playing Yu-Gi-Oh in general,
Hmm.
which are trigger effects, excuse me, and ignition effects. So, trigger effects are those effects that activate whenever a condition is met.
Hmm.
So it'll say when X effect or when X happens, do Y. So if you
Hmm.
look at the case of Gazuki, it says if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can banish a zombie from your graveyard except Gazuki, special summon a zombie from your hand. So the condition was Gazuki going to graveyard, and then the effect was banishing a zombie from your graveyard, special summoning a zombie from your hand. Now,
Hmm.
if you look at the case of Samurai Skull, it says when this card is normal summoned, you can send a zombie type monster from your deck to your graveyard. Now, there was a key difference in those two. I don't know if you caught it yet. Um, Gazuki says if this card is sent to the graveyard, whereas Samurai Skull says when this card is normal summoned. So the difference between if effects and when effects is that if it says when this card is normal summoned, you can send. When it says when and then it's followed by a semicolon or a comma or a colon, and then it
Hmm.
says you can, it can miss the timing. So
Hmm.
anything that's chain link 2 or higher when the condition is met will end up missing the timing. So I believe Gear Town's a good example. If
Hmm.
if a first player tries to destroy Gear Town with a card like Double Cyclone, and he targets his opponent's card and his own Gear Town, the other player then activates his own, say, Double Cyclone, and pops the Gear Town as well as his own card. What'll end up happening is Gear Town is destroyed in Chainlink 2, and then Chainlink 1 still has to resolve. So because there was something that had to resolve before Gear Town could activate, Gear Town will end up missing the timing.
Hmm.
Whereas if you look at the effects of something like Gazuki, it says if this card is sent to the graveyard, you can. So Gazuki will never miss the timing. So
Hmm.
say I activate an effect to of like Solitaire to tribute my own Gazuki. I'm gonna summon a monster from deck. Well, actually, that tributes his cost. But say I activate my own Treacherous Trap Hole,
Hmm.
and I'm targeting my own Gazuki and your monster, and you chain Treacherous Trap Hole, targeting my own Gazuki and your own monster. It doesn't really matter what you're targeting.
Hmm.
Gazuki goes to graveyard in Chainlink 2, and the other Treacherous Trap Hole still has to resolve. But the difference is that Gazuki says if this card, so even though the other Treacherous has to resolve, as soon as the chain link ends, Gazuki will still activate because it can't miss the timing.
Nice. So at the beginning here it says you can't. So just like you can. So that would be an example of just an ignition effect, right? So like something you just have to start yourself.
Yeah, so an ignition effect, if you're talking about Gazuki, it says
Hmm.
during your main phase, you can send a zombie from your deck to your graveyard. That's an effect. It's almost always spell speed 1, meaning you can only use it in the time zone or the point in the duel that is allotted to you. So it says during your main phase. So you
Hmm.
can only activate it during your main phase when nothing else is going on. Um, Now, there are some that say during your main phase quick effect. So if you look at Malayhu, it says
Hmm.
during either player's turn, so it's a quick effect. Then you can activate it in response to other cards and whatever. But most of the time you'll see it say like during your main phase, during the battle phase.
Hmm.
So you can only activate it at that time. So this says during your main phase you can send a zombie from your deck to your graveyard. So the main difference between ignitions and triggers is ignitions cannot be used at all times, whereas triggers can. So a good example of that is Mermail Abyss Lind. Abyss Lind says if this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, you can summon a Mermail from your deck.
Mm-hmm.
So Mermail Abyss Lind is destroyed by battle. Now, it's not a spell speed 3, and it doesn't modify attack,
Mm-hmm.
so normally you can't activate those in the damage step. But because Abyss Lind is a trigger effect,
Mm-hmm.
it can always activate as long as the trigger is met, so even in the damage step, it can still summon from deck.
Sweet. Well, thank you very much for that. So we have also this one, Levianeer, just got released, but at the bottom it says you can only use this effect once per turn. What does that mean?
Yeah, so there's two different types of, or two different subcategories, I should
Mm-hmm.
say, amongst effects that are limited to once per turn. So Levianeer specifically says you can only use this effect of Chaos Dragon Levianeer once per turn.
Mm-hmm.
There are other cards that'll say you can only activate this effect of X card once per turn.
Hmm.
So the difference between those is the words use and activate. If the card says use, like in the case of Levianeer, as long as you attempt to use the effect, you can no longer use the effect for the rest of the turn. So say
Hmm.
you activate Levianeer's effect, and you're going to blow up 2 cards on the field, and your opponent activates Rebirth of Parshath, discards a counter trap or discards a card by revealing a counter trap, he negates the Levianeer. Now if you were to summon another Levianeer, you still can, but you cannot use the second effect of Levianeer, depending on what you banish to activate the effect, because you attempted to use the first Levianeer. Even
Hmm.
though it was negated, you attempted to use it, so you cannot attempt to use it again. Whereas, if the card says you can only activate this effect once per turn, if you activate a trap card and your opponent activates Wiretap in response, trying to negate this trap card,
Hmm.
and the trap card says you can only activate this card once per turn, since you didn't technically activate it because the card was negated, you can proceed to then activate another copy of that card because it was negated.
Nice. So, or in like the case of banishment here, if they negate it, I can activate another one because they negated the activation. So
Correct.
it's like the activation didn't happen. But
Right, exactly.
what about like navigation here? So it says you can negate the effect. Is that the same as negating the activation?
No, and that's an important distinction to make. So there's two different types of effects, and those actually play into the damage step as well. So when a card says you can negate the effect of a card,
Mm-hmm.
so in the instance of navigation, you're negating the effect of a face-up card. The card was still activated, and the activation was still successful,
Mm-hmm.
but when the card tries to resolve, it no longer has an effect
Mm.
because you negated it. So in the case of like banishment, if your opponent activates banishment and you negate the effect with the navigation banish,
Mm-hmm.
your opponent still activated the banishment, so they're still restricted in that way. Now, a difference I said earlier between negating activations and negating effects is that even though negating effects sounds better because now they can't activate another navigation, that's great, but you cannot negate effects in the damage step.
Mm.
Unless negating the effect, like in the case of Forbidden Chalice, where to modify attack, then you can. But normally, negating the effect of a card can only be used in the main phase, standby phase, battle phase, end phase, draw phase.
Mm.
Whereas if it negates the activation of a card, so counter traps like Rebirth of Parshath and Wiretap and Debunk,
Mm-hmm.
if they negate the activation of the card, they can be used in damage step. But for cards like Banishment, if you negate the activation, they can activate another. So it's kind of a give or take. Each card has its own strengths and its own weaknesses.
Yeah. So this one, Dark Sea Float, nobody really plays it, but we said it's important. Why is that?
Yeah, so Dark Sea Float is important. So it says when this card on the field is destroyed by a card effect and sent to
Mm-hmm.
the graveyard, the owner of this card draws 1 card. Now it's kind of a niche way of describing the text. Normally it says you can draw 1 card or you draw 1 card. But the difference between Dark Sea Float and a card like Samurai Skull, if
Mm-hmm.
you wanted to go back to Samurai Skull, it says when this card is normal summoned, you can send a zombie from your deck to your graveyard. The key difference is Samurai Skull says you can send.
Mm-hmm.
If it says when this card is normal summoned, you can send, it can miss the timing. But in the case of Darksea Float, it says when this card on the field is destroyed and sent to the graveyard, the owner of this card draws one card. It never says you can, so even though it's a when effect, it does not ever miss the timing. So going
Mm.
back to the example of Gazuki and Treacherous, if I have a Darksea Float on the field, and I activate Treacherous to destroy my Darksea Float and another monster, and my
Mm-hmm.
opponent chains Treacherous to destroy Darksea Float and another monster, even though Darksea Float was destroyed and sent to the graveyard on Chainlink 2, and the other Treacherous Trap Hole still has to resolve,
Mm-hmm.
regardless of whether or not it still has a target on the field, Darksea Float will not miss the timing because it does not say you can.
Mm. So that's a very good thing to know. So when you're looking at the wins, a lot of people think just whenever it says a win, it has to be able to miss timing. But you say since it doesn't give us an option, there's no way to miss the timing.
Right, the game essentially forces you to draw a card, which is never a bad thing, of course.
Sweet. So then we said our last example here is Neos Fusion. Why can I not negate the graveyard effect?
Yeah, so I actually get this question a lot. So in the
Mm-hmm.
case of Neos Fusion or the Synchro Monster, he's a level 10 Shiranui Sun Saga.
Mm-hmm.
Both of them have some sort of protection effect. So Neos Fusion specifically says if a fusion monster or monsters you control that lists Elemental Hero Neos as a material be destroyed by battle or card effect, or
Mm-hmm.
shuffled into the extra deck by its own effect, you can banish this card from your graveyard instead. So the important part about that text is it
Mm-hmm.
says instead. So when a card text like Neos Fusion says instead, it's kind of scapegoating whatever would
Mm.
happen in the first place. So it doesn't actually activate and thus it can't be negated. So if, for instance, you're saying Treacherous Trap Hole, you activate Treacherous Trap Hole, target the Elemental Hero Brave Neos, the fusion monster, and another monster, while Neos Fusion's in the graveyard.
Mm-hmm.
On resolution, you decide whether or not to use Neos Fusion as a scapegoat to
Mm.
destroying the Brave Neos. So rather than the Brave Neos being destroyed, the Neos Fusion is banished, so it doesn't activate and it can't be negated in that way.
Mm. So it's more like an alternative outcome instead of something I need to decide right away.
Exactly.
Mm. Well, those are a lot of really important distinctions. I want to thank you again for agreeing to come on. It was very helpful. I think a lot of people learned a lot. I know I learned a lot, especially because a lot of these are really, really confusing.
Yeah, I mean, Konami, Yu-Gi-Oh! In general has been around for such a long time that Konami's been changing stuff and messing with ideas. So
Hmm.
it's all kind of jumbled together, and it's important to be able to actually know how to read the card and understand what the card is trying to do so that you can understand what your strengths and your weaknesses to your deck are.
Hmm. Well, I want to thank you again for coming on. I want to thank you all for watching. If you have any other ideas for Duel Academy videos, have any other questions, let us know, and we'll make a video about it. But if you like this video, make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Make sure you follow the Discord, get in the Twitch, join the tournaments, and I'll see you around. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.